I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Welcome to this podcast of the People's Pharmacy.
You can find previous podcasts and more information on a range of health topics at peoplespharmacy.com. 30 years ago, our guest worried about the coming plague. She warned that infectious disease could sweep the planet. This is the People's Pharmacy with Terry and Joe Graydon.
Laurie Garrett has been warning for decades that public health is being neglected. How have global missteps led to the current challenges brought on by COVID-19? Will we have to live with this coronavirus forever?
What should we have done differently? And how should we prepare for the next pandemic?
Can we improve the public health toolkit to better respond when the next pathogen shows up?
Coming up on the People's Pharmacy, find out what we should learn about the coming plague.
In the People's Pharmacy Health Headlines, pandemic stress has had an impact on blood pressure. A new study that utilized data from hundreds of thousands of people in employee wellness programs found that their blood pressure increased significantly during the last 9 months of 2020. The average change between April and December 2020 was up to 2.5 millimeters of mercury for systolic blood pressure and 0.5 millimeter for diastolic blood pressure. That may not sound like a big change, but with so many people affected, it could be quite serious. Women experienced a greater increase than men. Experts predict that even small elevations increase the risk for heart attacks, strokes, heart failure, and kidney disease. Although the researchers can't identify the reason for the increase, some possibilities include less exercise, more alcohol consumption, and sleep disruptions as a result of stress.
Millions of cataract surgeries are performed every year in the U.S. Beside improving vision, this procedure may actually help reduce the risk of developing dementia. Investigators at Kaiser Permanente, Washington, collected data on more than 3,000 older adults with cataracts. The participants were part of a prospective longitudinal study of cognition that lasted from 1994 till September 2018. People who had their cataracts removed were 30% less likely to be diagnosed with dementia. This apparent protection lasted for at least a decade. The researchers controlled for factors such as diabetes, elevated blood pressure, heart disease, and weight. Glaucoma surgery did not produce any change in dementia risk. The authors speculate that social isolation resulting from impaired vision could be a contributing factor. In addition, the quantity and quality of light admitted through the lens could also be mitigating problems caused by cataracts.
Scientists at the Cleveland Clinic have done an impressive job exploring possible drugs to prevent Alzheimer's disease. They started with gene mapping to identify which medications might reduce accumulation of amyloid and tau in the brain. Next, they reviewed animal research on the best candidates. Sildenafil, better known by its brand name Viagra, topped the list. Next, they analyzed insurance claims covering more than 7 million Americans. People taking sildenafil were 69% less likely to get an Alzheimer's diagnosis during 6 years of follow-up. Test tube studies showed that sildenafil helped neurons grow new projections and dampened production of tau. The authors were careful to note that this research does not establish cause and effect. For that, we'll need randomized controlled trials in humans at risk for dementia.
Identifying people who are more likely to be susceptible to dementia will be even more important when there are medications that might prevent it. A Swedish study suggests that a simple heart rate measurement could be a good clue. Scientists followed more than 2,000 individuals over 60 years of age. During the 12 years of follow-up, people with a resting heart rate of at least 80 beats per minute were 55% more likely to develop dementia than those whose resting heart rates were between 60 and 69 beats per minute. The association remained even after adjusting for cardiovascular disease, a known risk factor for dementia.
Pediatricians often advise parents to switch young children from whole milk to low-fat or skim milk once they pass their second birthday. The idea is to prevent weight gain and metabolic syndrome. An Australian study suggests that's not necessary. Researchers enrolled 49 youngsters between 4 and 6 years old to a randomized, double-blind study. They got whole milk products or low-fat milk products for 3 months. Even though whole milk has more fat and more calories, children consuming it did not gain weight or have any changes in their blood lipids or serum glucose. And that's the health news from the People's Pharmacy this week. Welcome to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Graydon.
And I'm Joe Graydon. Today, we're talking about the coming plague. Not COVID-19, but a prediction that was made almost 3 decades ago by Laurie Garrett.
How is it that we were so ill-prepared for the current crisis? After all, Laurie Garrett and a few others were warning that an infectious disease like COVID-19 could spread around the world.
To learn more, we turn to Laurie Garrett herself. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, recently named as the 2021 Senator Frank R. Lautenberg Awardee by the Rutgers School of Public Health. Ms. Garrett is the author of The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, and Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health.
Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. Laurie Garrett, it's been a long time.
Oh, it's good to be back.
Now, Laurie, we interviewed you 26 years ago, and that was shortly after your book, The Coming Plague, first came out. Did you ever imagine a pandemic like COVID-19?
Yes and no. In general, I always thought we were headed towards a massive pandemic. And I really don't actually think COVID is the massive pandemic. I think there is still worse to come. But what I didn't imagine was the scale of government incompetence, lies, the sheer scale of refusal to participate in taking public health measures, and that it would be true in so many parts of the world, so many different cultures, so many different political systems, that I was not prepared for.
So, Laurie, you are talking about a major disaster on the part of the way in which this virus was handled by not just the United States, but by lots of governments. Can you give us some examples, please?
Well, first of all, I have to say at the sort of multinational global level, the 50,000-foot level, we've seen all the systems that we have created through the World Bank, the United Nations, WHO, et cetera, fail. Just absolutely, totally fail to address the crisis in an appropriate way. And then we've seen the sort of, high-level, grandiose systems of capitalism fail, whether it's Davos and the World Economic Forum, or it's the World Bank and IMF, or the G7 and G20, or whether you're talking about the Fortune 500 corporate level. So what we've seen is a complete breakdown on international solidarity. So that worst case scenario always was that if a pandemic hit, the rich world would survive and watch the poor world die. And that's pretty much where we're at. And, still less than 2% of Africans have seen a single dose of vaccine. And we're approaching 80% in the United States. And there are countries that have exceeded 90%. And they are all wealthy countries. So that's the first scale of absolute catastrophe. And then let's look at, say, Brazil, where now the powers that be in the society are gathering forces to try Jair Bolsonaro for mass murder because of how much he bungled and obstructed public health efforts to combat COVID in Brazil. I think we also have to say that global capitalism really failed, more than I would have thought would be the case. It's interesting because as we speak, there are climate change negotiations going on, and we're seeing a very similar problem that there's some mobilization of resources from the wealthiest end of capitalism, but it's not what you would have thought. It's not major corporations saying our bottom lines are being hurt by this. Our bottom lines are being hurt by this. I was just in a meeting today, an off-the-record meeting, in which a top financial analyst said that the amount of losses already experienced since January 2020 in the COVID crisis make it the greatest economic catastrophe of our lifetime. You would think that in the greatest financial catastrophe in our lifetime, where it's estimated that the bottom 100 poorest countries will lose close to $4 trillion in net wealth, that you would think this would be a time for fantastic amount of soul searching and pressure from the top, barons of wealth and capitalism, that they would be saying, look, our whole supply chain's falling apart. We can't get computer chips from this part of China to this part of France. We can't get Christmas toys to the kiddies for their trees. They're all stuck out on ships off of Long Beach. What the heck is going on? Let's clean this mess up. Let's stop this epidemic. And yet we see a kind of knee-jerk response all over the world, even in places where people are ruled by more benevolent, popular governments. We see that money moves where hope moves. So, a drug company says we have a pill and we think it'll work, and the stock market goes bananas for a couple of days. Woohoo! It's almost over, and then boom, the same part of the world says, "Oh my goodness, this Delta variant is wiping out huge percentage of our population," and the market comes back down. We see this over and over, and this is not long-term fiscal policy. This isn't long-term smart think, and it certainly has nothing to do with what is the end game in this pandemic. So I'm disappointed with every tier and every level you look at. When you get down to the level of states and cities, you see some atrocities that are just, almost unfathomable. Texas, for example, I was just looking at their own state data today. This is the official state of Texas data. They show a 90% differential between survival of unvaccinated versus fully vaccinated seniors over 70 years of age. Now, you would think that would be enough to get all of the Texas political leadership to say, ladies and gents, let's get out there and get those shots in the arms. We have so much evidence of the efficacy of our vaccines that to, at the very least, shrug in the face of them and to actually try to block access or take sides with those that doubt the vaccines can work at all, or actually say no, refuse them, join Robert F. Kennedy Jr. in the bandwagon of out and out total refusal. That to me is beyond politically irresponsible. It's actually saying, for ideological reasons, you're prepared to have a sizable percentage of your population die.
Which just doesn't make sense to me. And yet, Laurie Garrett, you've been looking at the big picture over the long term. You're saying other people are not giving this a long-term response, but you've been considering the possibility of the coming plague for over 3 decades now. When you first heard about an infection in China late in 2019 that was causing pneumonia, did it feel like the start of a horror movie?
Well, I don't know about a horror movie. I don't really think in those terms, but it did feel to me like deja vu all over again, because I was in China during the SARS epidemic, and I was in Hong Kong, and then went all over tracking it in Southeast Asia. So I felt like, oh my God, here we go again. The same sort of cover up, the same sort of incompetence throughout the international system. I thought we had learned our lesson after SARS, and we had created the international health regulations that were supposed to force real transparency and, honest broker relationships between countries with active epidemics and WHO. And yet we were seeing just the opposite once again. And I had, by the middle of the first week of January 2020, so I would say by January 2nd or 3rd, I had already decided that this was going to be a pandemic, that it had most definitely already made its way outside of China. And as we watched the Chinese government give obviously false case numbers to WHO, and then when questioned directly, WHO officials would say, well, this is what we're getting from them. It's not for us to say whether we think they're lying to us. I thought, oh my God, how many people have to die before you say these guys are liars? And it's very interesting. If you look at January 18th, 19th, and 20th of 2020, you see a very bizarre set of things going on. The officially reported numbers out of China are stagnant, and then they actually go backwards as if, some people came back to life. There was a Lazarus effect and they're no longer dead. And they were all in the roughly, if I remember right, somewhere around 70 or 80 cases, deaths. And then all of a sudden, after the 19th, they skyrocket. And you get up into the 300, 400 range, So what was the difference? The difference was that Xi Jinping himself personally stepped in. He decided that he was hearing reports from rather well-respected scientists like Zhang Nanshang, who had been credited with discovering SARS back in 2003, actually in 2002. And he was hearing that the situation in Wuhan was out of control.
Uh-huh.
And so he told the state council, I'm going to start firing people, and I want real numbers.
You're listening to Laurie Garrett. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, recently named as the 2021 Senator Frank R. Lautenberg Awardee by the Rutgers School of Public Health. Her first book was The Coming Plague: Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance.
After the break, learn more about wet markets in China and disease reporting there.
Did any countries respond well to this crisis?
Some people point to India and suggest that ivermectin was responsible for the dramatic drop in cases. Is that a likely explanation?
We'll also discuss what missteps we made in the U.S. You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is made possible in part by CocoVia, maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements. Cocoflavanols are among the most well-studied plant-based nutrients, backed by 20 years of scientific research.
CocoVia Cardio Health is available in capsules or powder, providing 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols daily. This supports better blood flow and vascular performance.
CocoVia also offers Memory Plus, supplements with 750 milligrams of cocoflavanols. This product is backed by 4 different clinical studies demonstrating significant improvement in several aspects of memory.
CocoVia flavanols are derived from real cocoa beans. They offer you all the benefits of chocolate without the sugar. More information at cocovia.com. Welcome back to the People's Pharmacy. I'm Terry Grayton.
And I'm Joe Grayton.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic products developed in Germany and made in the USA. KAYA Biotics.com.
Also by CocoVia, offering its cardio health product with 500 milligrams of cocoflavanols in powder and capsule form. More information at cocovia.com.
Also by Verizana, an analytical laboratory providing home health tests for hormones, gut health, and the microbiome, now with an annual health club plan. Online at verisana.com/health-club.
Today, we are looking both backward and forward. Our guest today predicted a global pandemic and started writing about emerging diseases more than 3 decades ago. At the same time, what lessons can we learn about COVID-19 so we can better prepare for the next pandemic? Were there any countries that responded well to the coronavirus crisis?
We're talking with Laurie Garrett. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, recently named as the 2021 Senator Frank R. Lautenberg Awardee by the Rutgers School of Public Health. In addition to contributing to the journal Foreign Policy and to NBC News, she's written 4 books: The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance; Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health; I Heard the Sirens Scream, How Americans Responded to the 9/11 and Anthrax Attacks; and Ebola, Story of an Outbreak.
Laurie Garrett, you've lived in China, and you know a great deal more about the reality there than most people reading the news here in the United States. Can you tell us a little bit more about the wet markets, a little bit more about transmission of disease, and finally, a little bit more about how they report what's going on?
All important questions, and I'm so happy you're asking them because we have a very dangerous U.S. versus China dichotomy that it threatens to be a Cold War. And it means that people aren't asking the right questions. They're not approaching the situation in China through a neutral lens. They're coming at it as if, we're the United States speaking to the old Soviet Union. And that's very unfortunate. We don't win in such a situation. We just get more and more angry at each other. Yeah, in 2003, the big lessons I learned, which then carried with me all the way to today, in part come from the fact that my older brother, Bannon Garrett, is a world-renowned China scholar who had, unfortunately, most of his writings are classified, but he was with CSIS and the Atlantic Council and quite a number of other think tanks. And he'd made, by 2003, I think he'd made 27 trips to China going back to the days of Mao Zedong. And so I had learned a great deal about Chinese politics and how it worked, how the Communist Party worked, how the state council worked, what went on at the provincial level versus the federal or national level. And then I had the Council on Foreign Relations, where I was for over 13 years, dealing with global health issues. I put a lot of work into even more deeply understanding China, and brought in a colleague, Yanzheng Wang, who was born and raised in China, but is now with Seton Hall in New Jersey. And had another great colleague there, Elizabeth Economy, who also is really quite the China scholar. Between them, I approached the 2003 epidemic already pretty well versed in how China worked. And I think it's really important to understand that there is very little relationship between what is said at the level of the premier and president, Xi Jinping and so on, the party leadership in Beijing, versus what is actually executed and done by local party officials out in the hinterland. And this is because each political unit of the Communist Party and then its allied corporations and other entities of various kinds, each one of these is competing against all of the others for the attention of the king, if you will, Xi Jinping, and they are reading tea leaves every day, trying to figure out, what does the party want us to be doing now? And what's going to get me ahead? And how am I going to get rich? And how rich am I allowed to get before I get in trouble for being too rich? Where's the cap? And how do I hide and offshore my money without getting in trouble with the party and ending up getting shot or imprisoned, as has happened to many? And so each epidemic, each outbreak is tied to a desire by local officials to constantly represent the achievements they've made in their district, in their province, in a positive light, always meeting the quotas and demands from Beijing. And if that means lying about how many children you vaccinated, lying about whether you have any outbreaks, lying about whether or not you close the wet markets full of wild animals, that's what you do. You create an image and you send the information to Beijing that Beijing wants to hear. The other thing is that corruption is a huge problem all over China. And a lot of local party officials have become very wealthy by tying themselves to companies that know if they tick off that party official, they're going to get shut down. So the party official gets a piece of the action. It's very sort of Tammany Hall-like, late 19th century New York corruption. Now, if you add on top of it a crisis, let's call it SARS 2003 hitting Guangzhou, well, the Guangdong and Guangzhou officials, want to send word to Beijing, we got an outbreak, but we have it completely under control. Don't worry about it. We know what we're doing. We know where it came from, where everything's figured out. And the numbers of people that are actually dying, very small, really trivial, nothing to worry about. And in the case of Guangdong, the Guangdong CDC actually refused to allow the Minister of Health of China to come into the facilities and investigate when he came to Guangzhou. So, I think as outsiders, Americans may not understand just how fractured things can be inside of China and may not appreciate that what could very well have happened, and I'm not saying this is, definitely the scenario, but it could very well have happened in Wuhan in 2019 as this new virus was beginning to circulate, is that the local party officials felt that it was their duty to present only positive news to Beijing. So they covered it up. They didn't tell anybody. They lied about their flu statistics. They lied about their pneumonia numbers until Li Wenliang and a handful of other doctors courageously went on social media and informed their colleagues, there's something out here that's not right. It looks like SARS in 2003 has come back. And, these people who spoke up all paid a price for doing so. Li Wenliang famously died of COVID himself. But they started an alert through the system that forced a series of lies built upon lies by the Wuhan party officials and civil authority until finally on January 19th, Xi Jinping has had enough and he tells the state council, I'm going to start firing people. Now, that doesn't solve anything. It still leaves the whole outside world at risk. And of course, famously, it forced most of China into lockdown, hundreds of millions of people into lockdown.
And that actually did stop transmission for a while or somewhat. I'd like to ask you about whether there are any countries that actually responded well to this crisis.
Yes, but you can look at a place like New Zealand, a place like Iceland. You start making a list and you realize most of your list is islands. They're either islands or they're peninsulas, like South Korea. There are quite a number of countries that have done very well, but they've been continuously re-challenged. And of course, famously now, New Zealand's back, with people protesting mask rules in the streets because the Delta variant has emerged in that country. I think that it's easier to say which countries have done really, really badly. And of course, the data is there to look at, whether you're talking about India, Russia, United States, Brazil. I mean, that would be your hit parade right there.
Well, that brings up the question of India. And I have to tell you, Laurie, I am fascinated.
And mystified.
India was just absolutely in dire straits. And their curve looked absolutely horrific. And then it dropped like a rock. And it has stayed down. And a lot of the people who contact us say, well, there it is. It's ivermectin. Ivermectin is the answer to COVID-19. And what's the matter with the U.S. government that it's not making ivermectin available at every street corner? So can you help us understand the India curve and what's going on with ivermectin?
Well, you're kind of mixing things up. Ivermectin, I would put over as one discussion box separate from what happened in India. But
well, the reason I mention it together is that a lot of people think that the Indian government basically handed out ivermectin to everybody.
Well, I know of no evidence of that. What I will say is this: India blew it. They blew it very badly. They are the biggest producer of vaccines in the world, and they're the second biggest pharmaceutical producer in the world, the largest generic pharmaceutical producer. About somewhere in the neighborhood of 40% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients found in all drugs and medicines that you and I consume, whether it's over-the-counter aspirin or your prescription meds from your doctor, come from India. The remainder of the number one big producer is China. So we have, like everything else in our, globalized economy, we make TVs, but we don't really make the TV. The TV parts, components are all made, say, in China and then assembled in the United States or boxed in the United States. It's pretty much the same with pharmaceuticals. So, I think there had been a lot of optimism that if a good, effective drug could be found to treat COVID or a truly effective vaccine, that India would be able to produce not just plenty for its own, but satisfy the needs of the poor countries of the world, and in particular, African nations. The AU had, placed orders for huge purchases of generic forms of the Pfizer vaccine to be purchased from the Serum Institute in Delhi. The problem is that Modi didn't really think there was going to be any problem with COVID in India and was really quite confident that measures he had ordered that had to do with social distancing would be sufficient. And as a result, there actually wasn't a stockpile of vaccine designated for the people of India. And then, as everybody knows, they had an absolutely horrendous epidemic. So much so that they couldn't keep pace of the funeral pyres and bodies washed up on the shores of the Ganges. And I think everybody by now has seen those images. And then they thought, well, India must have done something right because that nightmare ended. And they just went to a low-level epidemic, a low level of infection. Many reasons have been put forward for why that is the case. But certainly one of them is that Modi came down hard on the Serum Institute, and generic vaccine production really cranked up. And India's now actually made its own unique Indian-made vaccine that is not a copy of anybody else's. And it has received approval from WHO, not only for use in India, but for mass distribution around the world. And they have executed a massive vaccination campaign all over India. I don't know that we have a really clear sense of what percent of this huge, highly diverse Indian population has actually been fully vaccinated. But definitely vaccination has played a big role. I think also the level of infection was so high, such a huge percentage of the population got COVID and got, the Delta variant, that in a sense they may have reached some, level of immunization in given communities that knocked the virus out of circulation for some time. Now, that doesn't leave them permanently, herd immunity protected and all that. They remain vulnerable, and we hear of outbreaks in specific parts of the country on an ongoing basis. I don't think ivermectin had anything whatsoever to do with it.
Now, Laurie, you mentioned that there were a number of other countries that got things really wrong, and you included the U.S. in that. In the next 2 or 3 minutes, could you just give us the highlights of the missteps that we made?
Oh, there were so many. I mean, we could be here for 2 hours, not 2 minutes. But in a nutshell, I think it boils down to a combination of hubris, really being cocky, really thinking we had these things under control and we didn't need to worry about it. We were Americans after all. And then, out and out lying, out and out deception by our own national leadership so that, hey, hydroxychloroquine, it's a cure. It is not. Hey, we can all take convalescent serum, says Peter Navarro as he marches into the FDA headquarters and starts screaming at the staff. Why don't you approve convalescent serum? I think we're now in a situation where each individual citizen of the nation is their own worst enemy, with our divisions, our mutual hatred and disdain, our mixing issues, so that at this point, if somebody refuses to wear a mask, is that an ideological objection? Is it a claim that they have asthma and therefore can't tolerate a mask? Is it a scientific argument of some sort? Or are they just, an arrogant human being? We can't separate the issues anymore. We are at each other's throats over every single piece of COVID-related policy. And we will probably remain so all the way through to the midterm elections, because it's in the interests of political leadership in key parts of the country to manipulate the situation and to use COVID as a political cudgel.
You're listening to Laurie Garrett. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, recently named as the 2021 Senator Frank R. Lautenberg Awardee by the Rutgers School of Public Health. In addition to contributing to the journal Foreign Policy and to NBC News, she's written 4 books: The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health, I Heard the Sirens Scream, How Americans Responded to the 9/11 and Anthrax Attacks, and Ebola, Story of an Outbreak.
After the break, we'll talk about a better toolkit for public health, as well as better funding.
How does Laurie see this pandemic coming to an end?
What role can we expect antiviral drugs to play?
Most importantly, how can we prepare for the coming plagues of the future?
Are more physicians aware of this topic now?
We'll also consider how to strengthen public health to prepare for climate change.
Have we learned anything from COVID-19 that will help us prepare better for the next pandemic?
You're listening to The People's Pharmacy with Joe and Terry Graydon.
This podcast is brought to you in part by Kaya Biotics, organic probiotic supplements. These supplements are made in the USA with high-quality, sustainably sourced ingredients.
Originally developed in Germany, Kaya Biotics offers 3 different formulations with 15 carefully selected strains of bacteria. These are designed to increase the diversity of your gut flora and support your immune system. More information at kayabiotics.com.
Welcome back to The People's Pharmacy. I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon.
The People's Pharmacy is brought to you in part by CocoVia, the maker of high-potency cocoflavanol supplements that support cognitive and cardiovascular health. More information at cocovia.com.
And by Kaya Biotics, microencapsulated, organic, hypoallergenic, probiotic products developed in Germany and made in USA. KAYABiotics.com.
We're talking about what we should learn to help us respond better to the next pandemic threat.
Our guest is Laurie Garrett, a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and author of 4 books, including The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, and Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health.
Laurie Garrett, you tell us that public health is at the bottom of the heap in the power structure. How can it get more respect, more continuous funding, and perhaps more important, a better toolkit?
Well, as you know, I put a lot of work into that question. My second book, Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health, I went all over the world on 5 continents trying to understand how different kinds of political systems were treating public health and why it was failing everywhere. There's a handful of countries around the world that have come up with ways to consistently fund and respect the concepts of public health. But now I think vaccination is the wedge that's being manipulated to drive the public against its own health leadership all over the world. You know, in 1947, smallpox broke out in New York City, carried by a tourist who came to New York. And we were fresh out of World War II, the great victors of the war. There was tremendous respect and admiration for leaders, for government. People were, I would say, it was a sort of de rigueur element of citizenship to be with the Scouts and the Red Cross and the United Way and the community chest and so on. So we had a sense of real community. And New York the city successfully vaccinated over 6 million people in 3 or 4 weeks against smallpox. And it was astonishing. It was a mobilization that involved everything from the Boy Scouts to the schools and every single business interest in all of 5 boroughs of New York City. We could not repeat that today. We could not repeat it anywhere in the United States of America today. And that is in large part because we've seen a rise of anti-government sentiments, of disdain for leaders, whether you're coming from the right or the left. It is, I don't respect authority. You can't tell me what to do, even if it is to save my own life. And I don't know how we get out of this. It's very interesting that even in the big infrastructure bill that just got passed by Congress finally and signed by the president, we see that the original requests for health and public health, clinical medicine and public health, which were in the neighborhood of about $57 billion in it, got cut down, way down, by more than half in the negotiations. And so we're going to see, $1 million here, $1 million there, parceled out across the needs of public health at a time when every single public health department in the United States of America is running on red, running on fumes, and losing staff right and left. And on top of everything else, individuals are getting death threats. They're getting attacked at school board meetings. They're getting their children attacked to the point where, Tony Fauci, as arguably one of the top public health officials of America, has received so many threats that he has a Secret Service detail protecting him at all times. And his whole family has to be protected. When you get to the point where somebody making $60,000 a year, despite having a PhD in health, trying to do the best they can to run a city agency in the middle of Kansas, to keep the water clean and the food safe to eat, the kids vaccinated, and respond to outbreaks and remind women to get their mammograms. And everybody to get their colon checked, et cetera, that individual should have, death threats every day because of COVID is almost unfathomable.
It doesn't sound like the America that we knew when we were growing up, but we're old. Laurie Garrett, I'm wondering, how do you see this pandemic coming to an end?
It won't.
So we're going to have to learn to live with COVID-19 forever?
It has now gone from humans into all the animal species that we have close association with that are mammals. You can find it now in everything from hyenas to elephants, from tigers in the zoo to your pet cats. So getting rid of this virus through a campaign of human vaccination only renders it somewhere in the background all the time. It's a new permanent element on the public health landscape, just as is HIV. We failed with HIV. We continue to fail with HIV. It has been the great pandemic of the latter 20th century and one of the 4 greatest pandemics of known human history. And we barely even talk about it anymore. We act as if it just somehow went away because we came up with medicines that are very expensive, but if taken appropriately in the rich world and then discounted to be affordable in the poor world, can hold the disease at bay and keep one's viral load down. But we know very well, the experiment's been done. 1 minute of letting off on the treatments, 1 minute of interrupting the supply, and HIV surges to become AIDS again. So that is now permanently, it's now been 3-4 generations of human beings that have had to deal with HIV/AIDS. I think we'll have an even worse problem keeping COVID under control because unlike AIDS, it's very easy to get. Unlike AIDS, it doesn't require physical contact. It is airborne.
Now, of course, a lot of people are putting their hopes in oral medicine, that we now have molnupiravir. There is a Pfizer drug that's coming online, and the hope is, antiviral drugs will save the day.
Well, again, that's what we ended up with HIV is recognizing actually you can't take any one antiviral drug. You need to take a combination because the virus will mutate around a specifically targeted, narrowly targeted medicine. But we don't see carnage in Chelsea and in the Castro district and in the south of Paris due to HIV/AIDS anymore. It's not a visible killer in our lives because combination drug therapy is available. And it has become a massive north-south effort involving PEPFAR and a variety of other programs to get medicines made in the rich world to the poor world in an affordable fashion to allow these governments, particularly South Africa, Swaziland, Namibia, Zambia, Malawi, to mass treat their infected population. So if we come up, if FDA ends up concluding that these new drugs from Merck and Pfizer, and there are others in the pipeline that will soon be announced, are in fact good treatments, then we're in the sort of oseltamivir phase, like Tamiflu, where you have to take the medicine very early in your infection, ideally in the first couple of days after you've been infected. And it will suppress your symptoms anywhere from 40 or 50% all the way up to 90%, so that your odds of needing hospitalization or dying are very low. That's great news. Each of these targets a different aspect of the viral life cycle. And I think down the road, we'd be looking at pressuring the drug companies to come off their patent high horses and allow combination therapy to be made, combining, across patent platforms to attack the virus on multiple life cycle levels simultaneously so that you're getting its polymerase cycle, you're getting its protease cycle, and so on. And that would be following the HIV model. But of course, this would still, just as is the case with HIV, these are astoundingly expensive drugs right now. And what these companies want is huge. They're not going to be affordable to the poor world unless we set up an HIV-like system to subsidize and distribute from the rich world to the poor. So you're back to the same darn problem over and over again. And then on top of it all, so far, there's no evidence that these drugs are appropriate to take as prophylaxis. So you're still going to get infected if you haven't been vaccinated. What you're looking at is a treatment modality that is not a cure. Not a cure.
Laurie Garrett, I'm wondering if you can offer some suggestions as to how we should be preparing better for the coming plagues of the future. You have indicated that you think there will be some, perhaps even worse than COVID-19.
Well, one of the reasons that this whole battle over what are the origins of this virus, where did it come from, and the charges and countercharges around it, one of the reasons it's also disturbing for me is that it's keeping us from actually confronting the problem in a way that could preclude such an event occurring again. So, if you want to argue, was it the result of Tony Fauci giving a grant, a very small grant to an American NGO, which passed some money through to a lab in Wuhan, and you want to, focus on the possibility that that lab accidentally or intentionally made the virus and then allowed it to leak through either deliberate intent or sloppiness. But what I've seen in the wet markets and the wild animal trade around the world is much more disturbing. HIV surely came out of the wild animal trade. Each outbreak of Ebola can be linked to connections between the wild animal trade and individuals in rural parts of Central Africa. And we're, clearly what I saw with SARS in 2003 was all about the wild animal trade. And it is a trade that is growing, not shrinking, and that is intimately tied to climate change in the sense that as our wild species become more and more stressed because their habitats are being devastated either by encroachment by human beings or by temperature changes and wildfires and droughts and what have you, then those animals, those stressed animals are starving. They come in, whether it's bats or horses or whatever they may be, they come closer and closer to human habitation and are more and more likely to be captured, to end up in wet markets, to end up in these very bad ad hoc zoo sort of setups, and eventually end up on somebody's dinner table. And this really is a gamble for the future of future generations of human beings. It all has to stop right now, this minute. It has to stop. There can be no justification for rounding up wild animals out of tropical rainforests or wherever you find them and selling them for human consumption in Canton. This is just immoral, it's wrong, and ultimately, for our species, it's suicidal.
Laurie Garrett, as we wrap up our time with you, I wonder if we have learned anything from the COVID-19 pandemic and if we'll be better prepared for the next one.
Well, I think we've learned quite a bit. The amount of science that has poured out is astronomical. At one point, my old friend and colleague, John Cohen of Science Magazine, said last year that he felt like he hooked up a fire hose every morning of new science into his mouth and it was just pouring in all day long until you collapsed and went to sleep. And I felt very much the same way, and I still do. I can't even begin to keep up with the science. It's astounding how much research, and some of it really dynamic, really innovative, breaking new ground. And of course, here we have mRNA-based vaccines proven to actually work, something that 5 years ago was a very iffy proposition put forward by a handful of scientists. This may change how we make a whole range of vaccines and treat a huge range of diseases, including cancer and Alzheimer's. So that's all very exciting. I think what we're slowest to learn on and learn about is how to organize ourselves as human beings in an appropriate way. We continue to aid and abet the microbes. We are their amplification system. So a remote, obscure virus can emerge someplace and stay in this remote area for years and years and years until some idiot comes along and does the wrong things and allows the virus to spread and then amplifies it through some human activity, whether that is through, the hatred and disdain that heterosexuals had of homosexuals in the 1980s, cutting them off from the rest of society in such a way that HIV was able to just spread like wildfire unabated in that community, or it's something related to failure to control mosquitoes and allow wild mosquitoes from other parts of the planet to come in on unregulated ships, jump from your port, and eventually take over, as is the case in Brazil with Zika and chikungunya and various types of dengue. So that now every summer in Brazil, you have mass death due to vector-borne diseases carried by mosquitoes. We are aiding and abetting. We are our own worst enemy. We either learn how to work together and to live on this planet with respect for all the other species on the planet, and recognition that the imbalances we make in ecosystems blow back in our face. We either do all that and learn that lesson from COVID, or we're just going to keep seeing more and more and increasingly spectacular outbreaks.
Laurie Garrett, thank you so much for talking with us on the People's Pharmacy today.
Thank you.
You've been listening to Laurie Garrett. She's a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, recently named as the 2021 Senator Frank R. Lautenberg Awardee by the Rutgers School of Public Health. Her books include The Coming Plague, Newly Emerging Diseases in a World Out of Balance, Betrayal of Trust, The Collapse of Global Public Health, and Ebola, Story of an Outbreak.
Lynn Siegel produced today's show. Al Wodarski engineered. Dave Graydon edits our interviews. B.J. Liederman composed our theme music.
This show is a co-production of North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, with the People's Pharmacy.
Today's show is number 1283. You can find it online at peoplespharmacy.com. You can subscribe to our podcast through your favorite podcast provider. We post the show on our website on Monday morning.
We welcome your comments. Look for the show notes for 1283 under the podcast tab.
At peoplespharmacy.com, you can sign up for our free online newsletter to get the latest news about COVID-19 and other important health stories. By subscribing to our newsletter, you'll also have regular access to our weekly podcast and find out ahead of time which topics we'll be covering. In Durham, North Carolina, I'm Joe Graydon.
And I'm Terry Graydon. Thank you for listening. Please join us again next week. Thank you for listening to the People's Pharmacy Podcast. It's an honor and a pleasure to bring you our award-winning program week in and week out. But producing and distributing this show as a free podcast takes time and costs money.
If you like what we do and you'd like to help us continue to produce high-quality, independent healthcare journalism, please consider chipping in.
All you have to do is go to peoplespharmacy.com/donate.
Whether it's just one time or a monthly donation, you can be part of the team that makes this show possible. Thank you for your continued loyalty and support. We couldn't make our show without you.